Official history remembers King Gustaf V, but buried inside sealed royal archives is another story, one that was never meant to survive. In the glittering world of Swedish royalty, where duty superseded all personal desires, one prince paid a price so devastating that it would reshape not just his identity, but his very soul. Crown Prince Gustav of Sweden, born Oscar Gustav Adolf on June 16, 1858, would indeed ascend to the throne and reign for over 4 decades. But the man who became King Gustaf V was not the same person who entered the world as the heir to Swedish crown. He was something else entirely, forged through a process of psychological transformation so complete that historians suggest the original Gustav essentially ceased to exist. The official narrative speaks of a reserved, dutiful prince who matured into a capable monarch. What it doesn't reveal is the systematic reconstruction of a human being, documented in royal archives that remained classified for over a century. These records, recently declassified by Swedish authorities, paint a picture of institutional control so sophisticated that it would make modern psychological operations seem primitive by comparison. The transformation of Prince Gustav was not accidental. It was engineered, deliberate, and ruthlessly effective. From his birth into the House of Bernadotte, Gustav was marked by what court observers described as an unusual sensitivity and artistic temperament that set him apart from the rigid masculinity expected of Swedish royalty. His father, King Oscar II, had grand ambitions for modernizing Sweden's place in European politics, and Gustav represented the continuation of that vision. Yet palace records suggest that from early childhood, there were concerns about his suitability for the harsh realities of kingship. If you're drawn to these hidden stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about European monarchy, make sure to subscribe. Because what you're about to discover about the making of King Gustaf V will reveal the true cost of royal power. The Swedish court operated under absolute principles. The monarchy's survival superseded individual desires. Royal image was more valuable than personal happiness, and duty to the crown trumped all human considerations. For Gustav, these principles would become the architecture of his destruction and reconstruction. Unlike his European counterparts, who could occasionally indulge their authentic selves, Gustav lived under a surveillance system that monitored his every breath, catalogued his every relationship, and analyzed his every gesture for signs of deviation from royal expectations. Palace historians now recognize that Gustav's childhood and adolescence were marked by what they describe as systematic behavioral modification, designed to eliminate any aspects of his personality deemed incompatible with kingship. Royal tutors compiled detailed reports on his emotional responses, social preferences, and intellectual development, creating what amounted to a psychological profile used to guide his transformation. The boy who entered the palace was methodically erased, replaced by a figure who could fulfill Sweden's desperate need for stability and respectability. But the process of creating a perfect king required destroying an imperfect human being. And the documents that chronicle this transformation reveal a story of psychological warfare so intense that it would change the very nature of what it meant to wear the Swedish crown. The education of a Swedish crown prince was not instruction. It was psychological warfare disguised as privilege. From the moment Gustav could walk, every aspect of his development was orchestrated by a team of royal advisors who understood that creating a monarch required dismantling the individual first. Palace records reveal that his daily schedule was designed not just to teach him statecraft, but to systematically eliminate any personality traits deemed incompatible with royal authority. The process was so thorough that court historians now describe it as institutional personality replacement. Gustav's formal education began at age 4, with what palace documents termed behavioral conditioning sessions. These were not traditional lessons, but carefully structured interactions designed to measure and modify his responses to authority, stress, and social pressure. Royal tutors compiled detailed psychological assessments, noting his natural inclinations toward art, literature, and what they described as excessive emotional expression. Contemporary reports suggest that these early observations became the foundation for a systematic program designed to suppress his authentic self. The academic curriculum itself was weaponized against Gustav's natural personality. While he excelled in languages, philosophy, and the arts, his tutors deliberately emphasized military strategy, political maneuvering, and what they termed masculine leadership principles. Palace archives contain detailed notes about his obvious discomfort with aggressive pursuits and his preference for intellectual over physical challenges. Rather than accommodating these natural inclinations, the court used them as evidence that Gustav required more intensive correction. By adolescence, the psychological pressure had intensified dramatically. Court records document what they called controlled isolation protocols, designed to limit Gustav's exposure to influences that might encourage his authentic self-expression. His friendships were carefully vetted, his reading materials monitored, and his recreational activities restricted to pursuits deemed appropriate for future monarchs. The goal, according to internal palace communications, was to create what they termed a clean psychological slate, upon which royal duty could be permanently inscribed. The surveillance extended beyond behavior modification to include detailed monitoring of Gustav's emotional responses. Palace physicians conducted regular assessments of what they described as his nervous constitution, documenting periods of melancholy, episodes of withdrawal, and what court records euphemistically termed resistance to royal obligations. These medical reports reveal that the transformation process was taking a severe psychological toll, but the palace viewed these symptoms as obstacles to overcome rather than warning signs of institutional abuse. Perhaps most disturbing were the systematic attempts to eliminate Gustav's capacity for genuine emotional connection. Court protocols required that his personal relationships be managed through official channels, his correspondence monitored by royal censors, and his private time virtually eliminated. The young man who had once displayed natural warmth and curiosity was being methodically transformed into an emotionally disconnected figure capable of performing royal duties without the burden of authentic human feelings. Military training became the final phase of Gustav's psychological reconstruction. While he demonstrated intellectual competence in strategy and leadership theory, his instructors reported persistent concerns about his lack of killer instinct and his visible discomfort with the violence inherent in royal authority. These assessments would become crucial evidence in the palace's growing realization that creating the perfect king might require destroying Gustav entirely. The Swedish royal court operated on a currency more dangerous than gold: information about its own members. In the shadowy corridors of royal power, where servants moved like ghosts and courtiers spoke in calculated whispers, an intricate surveillance network monitored every breath, every glance, every private moment of the royal family. For Crown Prince Gustav, this invisible web of observation would become the primary instrument of his psychological transformation. Palace records reveal that by the 1870s, the Swedish court had established what historians now recognize as one of Europe's most comprehensive internal intelligence systems. The architecture of royal surveillance was elegant in its brutality. Trusted chamberlains compiled daily reports on Gustav's activities, documenting his companions, his emotional states, and any behavior deemed inconsistent with royal bearing. Kitchen staff monitored his eating habits and recorded conversations overheard during meals. Even his personal valet, bound by sacred oaths to the crown, was required to submit detailed assessments of the prince's private conduct. These documents, classified for over a century, reveal a young man living under constant observation, where every human interaction was scrutinized for potential threats to royal stability. According to contemporary court records, the first serious concerns emerged during Gustav's university years. Reports began circulating about his unusually close relationships with male classmates and his apparent reluctance to pursue romantic attachments with suitable noblewomen. Palace archives contain coded assessments describing Gustav's excessive emotional displays toward fellow students and his troubling disinterest in appropriate matrimonial prospects. The language was diplomatic, but the implications were understood by everyone involved in the royal surveillance apparatus. The court's response revealed the sophisticated nature of their control mechanisms. Gustav's social circle was gradually restructured, with questionable companions quietly transferred to distant positions or removed from court entirely. His academic schedule was modified to eliminate unsupervised interactions, and his living arrangements were adjusted to ensure constant oversight. Palace protocols justified these changes as necessary security measures, but private correspondence between court officials suggests a more urgent motivation: the systematic elimination of any influences that might encourage Gustav's authentic self-expression. What terrified the Swedish establishment most was not Gustav's private inclinations themselves, but the possibility of public exposure. European royal houses existed in constant fear of scandal, understanding that their legitimacy depended entirely on maintaining carefully constructed images of moral authority. Intelligence reports from this period reveal obsessive monitoring of foreign press coverage and aggressive suppression of any rumors that might damage Swedish royal prestige. The crown's reputation was literally valued above the prince's psychological well-being. Court physicians began documenting what they discreetly termed nervous disorders in Gustav's behavior. Palace medical records described declining appetite, disrupted sleep patterns, and what servants reported as hours spent staring silently out palace windows. The young man who had once charmed European diplomats with his intelligence and wit was slowly disappearing behind a mask of royal obligation and mounting psychological pressure. But the palace's carefully constructed surveillance network was about to uncover evidence that would force them to escalate their campaign of psychological control to levels that would fundamentally alter Gustav's very identity. When Gustav officially assumed his full duties as crown prince in the early 1880s, the Swedish court believed their psychological reconstruction project was nearing completion. The surveillance, the isolation, the systematic elimination of his authentic self, all of it had been designed to transform him into the monarch Sweden desperately needed. But what the palace failed to understand was that suppressing a person's fundamental nature doesn't eliminate it. It creates a psychological pressure cooker where the authentic self and the performed self exist in constant, devastating conflict. The ceremonial recognition of Gustav as heir apparent was a masterpiece of royal theatre. Dressed in the ancient regalia of Swedish kings, he stood before parliament and nobility, reciting oaths that bound him not just to the crown, but to a lifetime of psychological performance. Contemporary accounts describe him as composed and dignified during the ceremony, but private correspondence later discovered in family archives suggests the enormous toll this public display demanded. Court physician reports from this period note increasing requests for treatments for what they euphemistically termed nervous exhaustion and persistent melancholic episodes. The pressure intensified exponentially with Gustav's elevated status. Marriage negotiations began in earnest, with European royal houses offering their daughters as potential queens of Sweden. According to diplomatic correspondence, King Oscar II initiated formal discussions with the royal families of Germany, Denmark, and Russia, each potential alliance carrying significant political advantages for Swedish interests. But palace insiders reported growing alarm at Gustav's apparent emotional detachment from these matrimonial possibilities. Royal marriage was not merely personal, it was a dynastic obligation that would secure Sweden's future and provide the next generation of heirs. Tell me in the comments what part of this story shocks you the most so far. And if you're enjoying this documentary, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this. The contradiction between Gustav's public role and his suppressed authentic nature created what court physicians documented as an escalating psychological crisis. As crown prince, he was expected to embody Swedish masculine ideals, military leadership, political authority, and dynastic continuation. Yet medical records suggest he found these expectations increasingly unbearable, not because he was incapable of performing them, but because the performance required the complete annihilation of his genuine self. Palace servants noted that he spent hours writing in private journals that were later destroyed on royal orders, and his closest attendants reported finding him in states of profound distress during rare moments of privacy. Intelligence reports from this period reveal that the court's surveillance network had detected what they termed concerning psychological instability in Gustav's behavior. While the details remained carefully coded in official documents, private correspondence between senior palace officials suggests they had identified specific warning signs that their psychological transformation project might be approaching a dangerous breaking point. These discoveries prompted emergency consultations between King Oscar II and his most trusted advisors, resulting in what palace records describe as enhanced intervention protocols designed to complete Gustav's psychological reconstruction. The palace faced a terrifying realization. Their systematic destruction of Gustav's authentic self had created a psychological crisis that threatened not just his stability, but the entire Swedish succession. Because what they decided to do next would push their psychological warfare to levels that would fundamentally alter the very nature of what it meant to be human. The Swedish royal archives hold secrets that were never intended for public scrutiny. Hidden behind layers of classification and royal privilege, a collection of documents reveals the true extent of the palace's obsession with controlling every aspect of Crown Prince Gustav's psychological development. These records, declassified only in recent decades after persistent pressure from historians, expose a surveillance operation so sophisticated and psychologically invasive that it would be considered unethical by modern standards. What they documented was not just Gustav's daily activities, but the systematic annihilation of his authentic self in service of creating what palace officials termed an optimal royal performance. The surveillance apparatus reached into every corner of Gustav's existence with clinical precision. Palace records show that his personal correspondence was routinely intercepted, copied, and analyzed by court officials before being resealed and delivered. His servants were required to submit detailed psychological assessments about conversations they overheard, emotional states they observed, and any changes in his behavior patterns. Even his reading materials were catalogued and analyzed, with palace librarians instructed to note which books he selected, how long he spent with each one, and whether the content might encourage what they called inappropriate introspection. According to declassified intelligence files, the court maintained what they called psychological monitoring schedules for Gustav's activities. These documents, written in careful bureaucratic language, tracked his emotional responses with the precision of a scientific experiment. They recorded the duration of his private periods, the frequency of his requests for solitude, and detailed assessments of his interactions with male courtiers. One particularly revealing report, dated 1883, describes Gustav as exhibiting persistent resistance to behavioral modification protocols and recommends intensified psychological intervention to achieve complete personality reconstruction. The palace's paranoia extended far beyond Gustav himself to include anyone in his orbit who might encourage his authentic self-expression. Court records reveal that several individuals were quietly removed from their positions after being deemed psychologically destabilizing influences on the Crown Prince. Their families received generous compensation for their discretion, and many were relocated to distant provinces where they could pose no further threat to the psychological transformation project. This systematic elimination of Gustav's genuine emotional connections left him increasingly isolated, surrounded only by individuals whose primary loyalty was to the royal reconstruction agenda rather than to his personal well-being. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the comprehensive psychological profile compiled by court physicians and behavioral specialists. These documents, hidden for over a century, reveal that Gustav was subjected to what would now be recognized as systematic psychological abuse designed to break down his resistance to royal conditioning. Palace medical records describe sessions with religious counselors aimed at eliminating what they termed moral deviations, experimental treatments with medications designed to modify his emotional responses, and isolation periods intended to break his psychological attachment to his authentic identity. The surveillance records also document Gustav's growing awareness that his every thought and feeling was being monitored and analyzed. Palace observers noted his increasing reluctance to express genuine emotions, his development of what they called performative behaviors designed to satisfy royal expectations, and his gradual withdrawal into a psychological shell that protected his remaining authentic self from further assault. Because what the surveillance network was about to uncover would force the Swedish court to implement the final, devastating phase of Gustav's psychological transformation. The human heart refuses to be governed by royal decree, and for Crown Prince Gustav, this fundamental truth would prove both his salvation and his systematic destruction. Despite the suffocating surveillance and psychological conditioning, he had managed to form connections that gave his existence meaning. Relationships that the Swedish court viewed not as natural human bonds, but as existential threats to their psychological reconstruction project. Palace records from the 1880s reveal that Gustav's closest relationships were with individuals who represented everything the royal establishment feared: emotional authenticity, intellectual freedom, and the dangerous possibility of human connection unconstrained by political calculation. Among the most significant of these relationships, according to court documents, was his connection with Lieutenant Erik Lindqvist, a young military officer assigned to Gustav's personal guard detail. Contemporary palace records describe Lindqvist as possessing what they termed artistic sensibilities unusual for a military position, and note that Gustav's demeanor underwent marked changes when Lindqvist was present. Intelligence reports from this period document excessive private consultations between the Crown Prince and his guard, along with what court observers described as inappropriate displays of emotional familiarity that alarmed royal protocol officers. Gustav's connections extended beyond individual relationships to include broader involvement with Stockholm's artistic and intellectual circles. Archival evidence suggests he had formed meaningful bonds with several prominent cultural figures, including painters, musicians, and writers who frequented court functions. These associations, while conducted with extreme discretion, represented a world beyond royal control, a community of individuals who valued creative expression and emotional honesty over social conformity. Court surveillance reports indicate growing alarm at Gustav's obvious pleasure in these environments where, according to contemporary accounts, he could briefly escape the psychological prison of royal performance. What terrified the Swedish establishment most was not just the existence of these relationships, but their potential to undermine the psychological transformation project. Private correspondence intercepted by palace censors revealed what court officials described as language of excessive emotional investment in Gustav's communications with male friends. While the specific contents of these letters were considered too psychologically destabilizing to preserve in official records, summaries compiled by royal intelligence suggest emotional connections that went far beyond the carefully managed relationships deemed appropriate for future monarchs. The palace response was swift and merciless in its psychological precision. Lieutenant Lindqvist was abruptly transferred to a remote military posting near the Norwegian border, officially for career advancement opportunities, but privately to eliminate his influence on Gustav's emotional development. Other members of Gustav's circle found themselves facing sudden social ostracism, financial difficulties, or mysterious professional setbacks that effectively ended their access to royal circles. According to declassified intelligence reports, the palace orchestrated what amounted to the systematic destruction of Gustav's support network, isolating him from anyone who might encourage resistance to the psychological conditioning process. The emotional impact on Gustav was devastating and carefully documented by court physicians. Medical records describe increasingly severe episodes of what they termed dissociative behaviors following these forced separations, and palace observers noted his growing emotional detachment from all human relationships. The young man who had once possessed natural warmth and intellectual curiosity was being transformed into something else entirely, a psychological construct capable of royal performance but incapable of genuine human connection. But the palace's campaign to eliminate Gustav's capacity for authentic relationships was about to achieve something far more destructive than they had anticipated. In the winter of 1885, the carefully maintained psychological equilibrium that had sustained Crown Prince Gustav through years of institutional conditioning finally collapsed. Palace records from this period reveal what court officials described as a complete psychological crisis that threatened to expose the full extent of the royal family's systematic destruction of their own heir. The breaking point came not from external scandal, but from Gustav's internal realization that the psychological transformation process had reached a point where his authentic self was being permanently erased in service of royal duty. The crisis began during what palace physicians recorded as a severe dissociative episode that occurred during a formal state function. Contemporary accounts describe Gustav suddenly leaving a diplomatic reception, his composure entirely shattered, and his carefully maintained royal performance completely abandoned. Court servants found him in his private quarters, according to confidential medical reports, in a state of what modern psychology would recognize as acute psychological breakdown. The palace physicians summoned to treat him noted that their traditional remedies, isolation, sedatives, and religious counseling, seemed to intensify rather than alleviate his distress. According to declassified royal correspondence, King Oscar II convened emergency sessions with his most trusted psychological advisors to address what they termed the Gustav crisis. These documents reveal the full extent of the court's panic as they realized that their psychological transformation project had pushed their heir beyond the breaking point. Intelligence reports suggested that foreign diplomatic observers had begun asking pointed questions about Gustav's sudden absence from official functions, and Swedish court officials feared that their carefully guarded secret might become public knowledge. Family intervention took a form that can only be described as psychological warfare. Palace records document a series of confrontations between Gustav and his parents that historians describe as systematically devastating to his remaining psychological defenses. While the specific details were never formally recorded for security reasons, private notes discovered in royal archives suggest that Gustav was presented with what amounted to a psychological ultimatum: complete the transformation into the royal persona Sweden required, or face the complete annihilation of his remaining authentic identity through more intensive conditioning protocols. What follows does not contradict the throne he later occupied. It reveals the cost required to reach it. Gustav's response to this ultimatum revealed the full tragedy of the psychological reconstruction process. Court observers noted that he seemed to undergo what they described as complete personality dissociation, speaking only when protocol absolutely demanded and displaying none of the intellectual curiosity or emotional responsiveness that had once defined his character. Medical records from this period describe increasing reliance on what palace physicians termed psychological stabilization treatments and document the systematic elimination of his capacity for spontaneous emotional expression. The psychological isolation deepened when Gustav discovered that even his most trusted personal attendants had been reporting detailed assessments of his emotional states to royal authorities. According to intelligence files, he conducted what court officials described as trust verification exercises, systematically testing each member of his household to determine their true loyalties. The results confirmed his worst psychological fears. Virtually everyone in his life was complicit in the systematic destruction of his authentic self. But the palace's success in breaking Gustav's psychological resistance came at a cost they had not anticipated, because what emerged from this process was not the perfect prince they had envisioned, but something far more disturbing: a psychological construct that could perform royal duties while remaining fundamentally disconnected from human experience. The Swedish palace had achieved something unprecedented in the annals of European royalty: the complete psychological reconstruction of a human being. By 1886, The systematic destruction of Crown Prince Gustav's authentic self had reached its final phase, where the remnants of his original personality were permanently subsumed beneath what palace records describe as an optimal royal performance construct. This was not merely behavioral modification. It was the creation of an entirely new psychological entity capable of fulfilling royal obligations while remaining completely disconnected from genuine human experience. The transformation process entered what court physicians termed consolidation protocols, designed to ensure that Gustav's newly constructed royal persona would remain permanently stable. Palace medical records document intensive sessions with psychological specialists who worked to eliminate any remaining traces of his authentic emotional responses. These treatments, described in clinical language that masks their psychological brutality, involved what modern psychology would recognize as systematic conditioning, designed to replace natural human reactions with carefully programmed royal behaviors. Gustav's daily existence became a meticulously orchestrated performance where every gesture, every expression, every word was calculated to maintain the illusion of royal competence while concealing the psychological void beneath. Court observers noted that he had developed what they called perfect royal comportment, displaying appropriate responses to diplomatic situations, ceremonial obligations, and family interactions without any apparent connection to genuine emotional experience. The young man, who had once possessed natural warmth and intellectual curiosity, had been replaced by something that could simulate these qualities without actually experiencing them. The physical isolation that had characterized his earlier conditioning was gradually replaced by controlled public exposure, designed to test the stability of his psychological reconstruction. Palace protocols required that Gustav be gradually reintroduced to official functions, diplomatic receptions, and ceremonial duties under careful supervision to ensure that his newly constructed persona could withstand the pressures of royal performance. Intelligence reports from this period document the success of these tests, noting that foreign diplomats and court observers detected no signs of the psychological crisis that had nearly destroyed the succession. Perhaps most tragically, the transformation included the systematic elimination of Gustav's capacity for genuine relationships or emotional connections. Court records reveal that he was taught to simulate appropriate social interactions while remaining psychologically detached from the people around him. His marriage negotiations, which had previously caused him such distress, were now handled with what palace officials described as perfect diplomatic composure, not because he had overcome his resistance, but because he no longer possessed the psychological capacity for genuine resistance. The psychological reconstruction had created what court physicians privately termed a functional royal entity, someone capable of performing all the duties of kingship while being fundamentally incapable of authentic human experience. Medical records suggest that Gustav had developed what they described as complete emotional dissociation, allowing him to participate in royal life without experiencing the psychological pain that had once threatened to destroy him. The palace had solved their problem by essentially murdering their heir's authentic self and replacing it with a psychological construct designed for optimal royal performance. Intelligence reports indicate that the success of Gustav's transformation was so complete that even his own family began to forget the person he had once been. The constructed royal persona was so convincing that it became, for all practical purposes, his new reality. But what the palace failed to understand was that their success would come at a cost that would haunt the Swedish monarchy for generations. By 1890, the Swedish royal family could declare their psychological reconstruction project a complete success. The dangerous prince who had once threatened dynastic stability through his authentic humanity had been systematically transformed into the perfect royal construct that Sweden desperately needed. Crown Prince Gustav, now fully conditioned and psychologically reconstructed, began demonstrating the behaviors that would eventually allow him to ascend the throne as King Gustaf V and reign for over 4 decades. The palace had achieved their ultimate goal, preserving the monarchy by sacrificing the man. The transformation's success was measured not by Gustav's happiness or psychological well-being, but by his ability to perform royal functions without creating scandal or instability. Palace records document his successful completion of diplomatic missions, his appropriate conduct during state functions, and his eventual marriage to Princess Victoria of Baden in 1881, a union that had been impossible before his psychological reconstruction, but became feasible once his capacity for genuine emotional resistance had been eliminated. Court observers noted that he fulfilled all ceremonial obligations with perfect technical competency, while displaying no signs of the psychological crisis that had once threatened Swedish royal continuity. Intelligence reports from foreign courts confirmed the palace's success in concealing the full extent of Gustav's psychological transformation. European diplomatic correspondences describe him as reserved but competent, dutiful in his royal obligations, and appropriately committed to Swedish interests. What these observers could not detect was that they were interacting not with a human being, but with a carefully constructed psychological entity designed specifically for royal performance. The Swedish court had successfully created the illusion of a functional heir while hiding the devastating cost of that functionality. The succession crisis that had terrified Swedish authorities for decades was quietly resolved through Gustav's successful psychological conditioning. When King Oscar II died in 1907, Gustav ascended the throne as Gustav V without any of the instability that palace officials had once feared. His 43-year reign was marked by political competence, diplomatic stability, and complete adherence to royal protocols, exactly what the psychological reconstruction project had been designed to achieve. From the perspective of Swedish royal continuity, the transformation had been an unqualified success. Behind the public success, however, palace medical records reveal a different story. Court physicians documented Gustav's continued reliance on what they termed psychological maintenance protocols, ongoing treatments designed to ensure the stability of his reconstructed persona. These records suggest that the transformation, while successful in creating royal functionality, required constant psychological reinforcement to prevent any regression toward authentic emotional expression. The man who became King Gustaf V was essentially a prisoner within his own reconstructed psyche, capable of performing royal duties, but incapable of genuine human experience. The cost of the palace's victory extended beyond Gustav himself to fundamentally alter the nature of Swedish monarchy. Royal protocols developed during his conditioning became institutionalized practices that would influence how subsequent generations of Swedish royals were trained and monitored. The psychological warfare techniques pioneered during Gustav's transformation established precedents for royal behavior modification that would persist long after his death in 1950. But perhaps most tragically, the palace's success in creating the perfect king had required the complete annihilation of the imperfect human being who might have offered Sweden something far more valuable than mere royal competence. King Gustaf V of Sweden reigned for 43 years, from 1907 to 1950, presiding over a nation that evolved from European backwater to modern social democracy. History remembers him as a competent, if reserved monarch who successfully navigated Sweden through 2 world wars while maintaining neutrality and stability. But the man who wore the crown for nearly half a century was not the person who had been born as Crown Prince Gustav in 1858. The crown survived. The man did not. The final tragedy of this story lies not in Gustav's failure, but in his success. The psychological reconstruction project that had seemed so dangerously close to destroying Swedish royal stability ultimately produced exactly what the palace had demanded: a monarch capable of fulfilling every royal obligation without the inconvenience of authentic human desires or emotional needs. Palace records from his reign describe Gustav V as a model of royal duty, handling ceremonial functions, diplomatic obligations, and constitutional responsibilities with mechanical precision that never wavered or faltered. For over a century, the true story of Gustav's transformation remained buried in classified archives, known only to a handful of royal historians and psychiatric specialists who understood the full scope of what had been accomplished. The Swedish royal family, like most European monarchies, operated on the principle that their legitimacy depended on maintaining carefully constructed narratives of natural royal authority and moral superiority. Gustav's truth, that he had been systematically destroyed and rebuilt as a psychological construct, was too dangerous to acknowledge, even decades after his death. Contemporary medical understanding of what was done to Gustav would classify it as systematic psychological abuse designed to eliminate authentic personality and replace it with conditioned responses. Modern trauma specialists who have reviewed the declassified palace records describe the transformation process as one of the most comprehensive examples of institutional psychological destruction in European history. What the Swedish court achieved through their conditioning protocols would be considered a form of psychological murder by today's standards. The recent declassification of royal archives has finally allowed researchers to piece together the full scope of this institutional crime. Documents that were once considered too psychologically disturbing to preserve have revealed the sophisticated surveillance networks, the systematic isolation protocols, and the methodical elimination of a young man whose only crime was possessing an authentic human nature incompatible with royal performance requirements. These revelations have forced a fundamental reassessment of what we understand about the true cost of monarchical power. Perhaps most heartbreaking is the realization that Gustav's suffering was entirely unnecessary. The Swedish monarchy could have survived with a king who retained his authentic humanity. Instead, they chose to wage psychological warfare against their own heir, ultimately creating a monarch who could perform royal duties while being fundamentally incapable of genuine human experience. The palace solved their succession crisis by murdering the person and preserving the function. If this hidden story has moved you, if it's made you question the true price of power and conformity, please subscribe. These buried histories matter because they remind us that behind every symbol of authority, every institution that demands absolute conformity, there are human beings who deserved the right to exist authentically. Gustav's authentic self died in the palace corridors of the 1880s, but his story survives as a warning about what we sacrifice when we value performance over humanity. His secret died with the empire that created him, but the truth of what was lost lives on.